Good evening. Welcome to your National Nordic Museum. I'm Lath Carlson, and I'm still getting introduced as the new director, so I'll live with that for a little longer. But I just want to welcome all of you tonight to this program. I think when I often think about our museums and our parks and our libraries and what unites us, it's really about curiosity. And it's people that are curious about the world that they live in and curious about each other and curious about kind of what's going on out there. So for us, hosting events like this really, I think, taps into that curiosity. So I'm really pleased to see the curious people in our audience tonight, because what we're presenting tonight is something I think that's on a lot of people's minds, is developing a better understanding of some of the new realities of what's going on in the world, and particularly, some of the relationships that are happening between countries in the Nordic region. So I think this is an incredibly timely event, and could not be happier to be hosting this here tonight for the curious people that are here. So thank you all for coming out. I want to thank our speakers and moderator for being here tonight to share hopefully some interesting insights and wisdom and maybe some questions about what's happening, so we can all kind of learn a bit more about this world that we're lucky enough to be in. So thank you all for coming tonight. And I'm looking forward to this probably as much, if not more, than all of you. So.
Good evening. My name is Marko. Liias. I'm a state senator in the Washington State Legislature. In the United States, I say that I'm the highest ranking Finnish American legislator. In Finland, I say I'm the only Finnish American legislator in the Washington State Legislature. So it's a joy to be with you. Like so many of you, I have family connections and heritage. My parents are both immigrants from Finland. My grandparents came with my mom and all their kids here 50 years ago. And so to think about this moment in our relationship with Europe through the lens of my heritage and what brought my family here, it is both scary and affirming. It is a reality that baked into the DNA of this region is our Nordic roots. And so when you look at our political geography and you look at our society here in Washington State, is clearly shaped by the Nordic values of folks who came before us. And I think we're going to have to lean into those Nordic roots of practicality and stewardship, maybe even some frugality as we weather the storms of this present moment in our country. And so we have assembled the most distinguished panel to help us answer every question you have about European security and trade here tonight. This is part of a continuing series of engagement between the University of Washington and scholars in Finland. And we're joined today, especially by a homegrown Washington diplomat as well. So I just want to briefly introduce Dr. Hiski Haukkala, who was the chief of staff to President Sauli Niinistö, who gave his fireside chat right here on this same stage in 2022, so it's appropriate that we have Dr. Haukkala back to follow in his previous boss's footsteps, to fill in the details of what's been happening since 2022. Dr. Haukkala leads Finland's preeminent international affairs institute. He says it's the only international affairs institute, but it is actually the preeminent one as well. John Koenig, I just had a chance to meet before, discovered that he has deep roots in Washington State, grew up in Gig Harbor, and is now retired in Bellingham. And in between Gig Harbor and Bellingham was a distinguished career of service to the American people as a member of our diplomatic corps. Excited to hear his observations as well. And then, of course, moderated by and the discussion led by a wonderful faculty member, Scott Radnitz, at the Jackson School at University of Washington. I think it's going to be a great discussion. I think we can all lean back in and remember what brought us to this place and hearken and sort of harness those roots and those values to get us through this period. And this panel is going to give us the meat to figure out how we're going to do that. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Haukkala, Ambassador Koenig, and Professor Radnitz.
Welcome to the stage. So the plan is that our speakers will each talk for 5 to 10 minutes. I'll ask some questions, and then we'll open it up and take questions from you. So who would like to go first?
Hiski?
Yeah, I'm happy to, of course. Well, first of all, Senator Liias, I would like to thank you your kind introduction and your generosity earlier today in terms of our conversations and discussions. I really value this opportunity very much. And I would also like to take this opportunity to very publicly and sincerely thank both the Washington State and the University of Washington for this exchange program, this opportunity for me and my spouse Maria to visit Seattle. We are happy and excited to be here today, and we are really grateful for this opportunity to meet so many interesting and wonderful people and discuss, I think, topics of mutual interest and of course also a rather grave concern. And also I want to thank the Nordic Museum for this opportunity to come back to this amazing building and this hall. I think my former boss, President Niinistö, might be slightly annoyed if he knew that I was actually now in the limelight in this very room where he performed in such a stellar manner. So in these opening remarks, I thought I would just try to make one argument, which is that we are living in a world and an era of three transitions, and these will affect, I would say, the United States. It will affect Europe, transatlantic relations. It will affect the whole of humanity, and the way we navigate these coming storms will have an immense impact on the future of our economies, our security, and the way we basically operate and coexist on this planet. And to start from the first transition, which is perhaps the most profound but quite often the least talked about, is the one where we see the advancement of climate change, where we see the continued loss of biodiversity. And this is a very important and pressing transition that will affect the very stage on which the other transitions are eventually played out. And as long as we don't really grapple with this reality and factor it into our debates and also our policies, we are in danger of making serious mistakes. The other transition is what we've been talking earlier today about at the Westin Hotel, where there was this technology luncheon, is the technological transition, which is equally important. And here in particular, I would say frontier technologies, disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, robotics, all of these things are profoundly transforming our economies, our societies in the coming years and decades, and obviously the way we fight, the way we secure our borders and our nations, and how we coexist as humanity. The final transition is actually the one that is most talked about, but I would say it's a function of these two other transitions, and it is the ongoing power transition in the world. The changing role of China in world politics, the recalibration of the US role, which we have been, I would say, witnessing for the past 15 years or more, and obviously the waxing and waning of other powers, and the emergence of some kind of a more multipolar setting in the world that we are witnessing here today. And we've had these kind of changes before. We had the Industrial Revolution. We have had sort of ecological changes in the past, and we have obviously seen great power transitions in the history of humankind as well. But I would argue never have we seen the confluence of all of these transitions coming together at the very same time and also operating on a very constrained time horizon. So instead of the Industrial Revolution, it was a century and a half. Now we are talking about a technological revolution that will take place in a matter of years and perhaps potentially a couple of decades. And this compression of time combined with these other transitions, I would say makes this particular situation very unique in terms of human history and has the potential to result in what could be called a perfect storm. Increasingly, when we look at this great power transition, it is framed as a bipolar US-China situation. But I would argue that Europe has a role to play here as well. And this is one of the other main message I want to convey here is today, that we should not, I'm hailing from Europe myself, so I cannot, but none of us should write off Europe as a force to be reckoned with going forward. I think Europe still has a lot to offer in terms of technology, scientific know-how. I don't want to be rude, but talking to an American audience where the talk of the town is reinvigorating industrial capacity in the United States, Europe actually still has industrial capacity. We still have quite a lot of, in terms of automotive industries in Germany, lots of industrial capacity in countries like Italy, Spain, France, and also including the country I know best, which is of course Finland and the other Nordic countries. There is still a lot we can do also in terms of enhancing our own security, and this is of course something we desperately need to do in order to fare well in the world in the coming years and decades. Now, zooming in on the topic and the title and the theme of this museum, Nordics. This is, I think, a very difficult question to unpack. On the one hand, the Nordics have been the very big beneficiaries of the previous order and previous regime. The last 50 to 70 years have been exceptionally kind for small nations. Open markets, open possibilities, relative security, I would say, even during the Cold War, and especially for the last 25 years. You could say that the Nordics have never had it so good that we have had for the last 70 or 80 years. And I would say, and this is the final message I want to leave you with, I think it can still be good for us in the future if, first of all, the Nordics and Europe, in conjunction with this wider setting that I was trying to paint in a very broad sort of brush strokes. First of all, we need to retain our place on the technological frontier. This is not a given. It must be admitted, hailing from Europe and the Nordics, that the United States and China are leading many of these essential races. And in order to fare well, Europeans need to get their act together and do better in order to stay in this technological race going forward. We must also, and equally importantly, adopt new technology sensibly and responsibly, but also courageously. This was actually something that was discussed today at the technological luncheon, that there are two things that you need to do in order to fare well in this race. It's to innovate, but also to distribute. You need to be able to ensure that these new technological innovations are distributed into our economies and societies in a courageous enough manner. But I would also add, thirdly, we must succeed to manage the downstream risks of these technologies. And this is probably something where actually the Nordics in particular have a lot to offer, because very high trusting societies, effective social safety nets, a lot of sort of prerequisites of riding the economic transition that probably awaits us are actually already in place in the Nordic countries. And we have to make sure that we keep these things in place. We must also push Europe forward and ensure that we stay in the race. And finally, make the case for the United States that the Nordics and Europe should be seen as a partner and as an ally, and not as a collection of individual lemon squeezers that Washington can use in order to extract the maximum amount of juice from us. Because I am still a fervent believer in the transatlantic alliance and the relationship, and I think there is still a lot we can do in order to keep it going forward. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to John's remarks and the conversation here today.
Well, let me begin by saying how happy I am to be here and by thanking Senator Liias for his introduction. This is my second time in the Nordic Museum. It's a real pleasure to be in such a lovely venue. I'd also like to thank the University of Washington, the Jackson School, and Scott, thank you very much for taking on the role of moderator. And especially I'd like to thank Hiski for such a broad and comprehensive and thoughtful introduction to this discussion. I'm not going to be quite so broad and perhaps not so thoughtful. I spent a lot of my career working on the transatlantic relationship in kind of some of the key parts of the transatlantic machinery. I worked for 3 years as our deputy permanent representative in Brussels at the North Atlantic Council in NATO, and then I also worked in the NATO command structure. And in addition to that, I worked quite a long time in Germany in different capacities, both before and after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm going to take a slightly different approach, one that's perhaps more driven by current events and the news. So let's begin with the most important point. I don't know if it's really necessary to enunciate it, but I feel as though I need to enunciate it to every audience I speak to, and that is that the current Trump administration seeks to establish an authoritarian regime in the United States, inside the United States, and domestic policy is the focus of this administration. This conditions everything. Trump wields great power domestically based on the weaknesses of the American Constitution, erosion and corruption of our key institutions, political and economic polarization, and an unhealthy information environment. So domestically, Trump is winning. The rule of law is becoming more constrained, is collapsing in a way. He effectively rules, it has ruled for now 110 days and more by presidential decree, even though we call them executive orders. At the same time, Trump's foreign policy is personal, predatory, and imperialist. Internationally, however, Trump and the US are much weaker relative to other actors, especially if those actors act collectively. Others, China, Canada, Mexico, Europe, Japan, many others, can and should push back against Trump's disruptive, predatory, and imperialist impulses. They should de-risk from the United States, in my view, and this may be a little different from what was said about the Atlantic relationship before, one that I firmly believed in for all my professional career. With this in mind, let's focus on European autonomy across a wide policy spectrum. First, defense and deterrent policy and capability. Some years ago, during the first Trump administration, French President Emmanuel Macron notoriously declared that NATO was brain dead. His outburst came after Trump withdrew American forces from Syria while other NATO allies still had forces present in the country, without consulting them at all, without even notifying them in advance. But Macron was right. There was a great hue and cry, but Macron was right. Whatever thinking was going on in NATO at that time, 2017, I believe, was happening in Washington. And Brussels and European capitals were not really deeply involved. The allies were expected to fall in line, spend more money, and keep their mouths shut, basically. That was how we operated in Brussels. That was my experience as well from even earlier in the alliance experience. Macron's words are truer than ever today, and his appeal for truly autonomous European defense and deterrent capability is finally at the center of European policymaking. I have never in my entire career seen as much happen on these topics as has happened in the last 3 months. NATO is regrettably brain dead, and it is on life support. The vital trust at the core of the alliance is essentially gone. Trump hates Europe and European institutions. And Europe's task, in my view, is not to try to revive the institutional husk of a security pact that may no longer be able to sort of rely on the alliance members themselves, but to harvest NATO's organs, to put it crudely, and to transplant them to European institutions that do not depend on or perhaps don't even include the United States. Europe has the capacity to make this transition to having its own autonomous defense and deterrence capability, most notably against Russia, but it has a whole lot of work to do to achieve the necessary institutional arrangements and capabilities. It can use the organs it harvests from good work that's been done in NATO, because after all, Europeans did more than half of that work. Europeans provide more than half of the staff of NATO headquarters. Still, the focus from the outset should be on autonomy, in my view, as an American saying this, not complementarity with the United States. Joint European development and procurement of key weapon systems and the development of a stronger defense industrial base will be central to this drive toward greater autonomy. So in that spirit, do not buy American when you can possibly avoid it. In this field, the Nordic countries are already showing the way and have for years in cooperation with among themselves and with other countries, including some of their Baltic neighbors, among others. This is a positive legacy, in my view, of Finland's and Sweden's former neutrality when they did have full spectrum defense capability that was developed for their nations. Given doubts about the US nuclear umbrella and extended deterrence, it will also be important to innovate rapidly in this field, and politically that is very difficult. Technologically, it's also not simple. Achieving an effective autonomous nuclear deterrent will not be easy, but it may be cheaper and faster than reaching full conventional deterrent capability. So what about Ukraine? This hasn't come up here yet, and I think we should probably discuss it a little bit in the Q&A. Polish PM Tusk has made some very striking points about Ukraine in two different ways, I would say. He said in March, 500 million Europeans are begging 300 million Americans for protection from 140 million Russians who have been unable to overcome 50 million Ukrainians for 3 years. And he said that to encourage Europeans to take on more of the responsibility for providing their own defense and encouraging them to believe that they have the capacity. But he also has been a little bit hedging with regard to how fully he's prepared to commit to prioritizing the defense of Ukraine over the rearmament of his own country first and foremost and Europe. And I think this is a very difficult issue that we might want to discuss. Now we'll look at economic and financial affairs briefly. I don't want to drone on here. But Trump and his team have generated a lot of drama over the past 4 months, as I'm sure you've noticed. With his April 2nd Liberation Day tariff announcements, Trump plunged world trade into kind of deranged uncertainty, endless uncertainty, to be honest. At this point, it's still not at all clear where this is headed. Since then, he has repeatedly retreated in the face of market reaction, but continues to hang a sword over the neck of America's trade relationships and the world economy, deliberately so, I believe. Last week, Trump folded for now in his confrontation with Beijing, but Trump immediately lashed out at the European Union for being even nastier than China in some way. So Trump has not won a single round in this tariff war, and the US, in my view, will not win a single round because the policy is incoherent. There is no policy worthy of the name. Trump has caused severe damage to America's standing in the world with no prospect of any serious benefit to the United States or others that I can see. But how should Europe respond to this? This has been a subject of much discussion in Europe. The answer lies less, in my view, in dueling with Washington over tariffs and more in reorienting economic activity away from the United States. Europe and European countries should work, in my view, toward building new financial, trading, and investment structures that are less reliant on the United States. Many other countries are already working on this project. Like defense autonomy, this is a long-term project, but much work is already underway, and you can see it in things like the agreement between Mercosur and the European Union. This will require deepening integration inside the European Union, but Europe should also open itself, in my view, to closer cooperation with others, including even China and the BRICS. And the BRICS, of course, include Russia, who seek to limit the power and reach of American economic levers because the general goodwill of America as an economic actor in the world can no longer be counted upon. So in conclusion, for more than 2 decades since America's brief unipolar moment in the 1990s, the world has been growing more multipolar. I fully agree with Hiski about this. Trump has accelerated the decline of America's place in this multipolar scheme, but the decline was inevitable, driven by internal and external factors of long standing, and some of them are related to technology and environmental factors such as those mentioned by Hiski. So in my view, America is back was a foolish declaration when Biden made it in 2021, and it is even more unrealistic today. America is not back, and in the sense that it was intended by Joe Biden, America will never be back. This old order has fallen. It's deteriorated to such a degree that it's no longer to be resurrected. It should not be lamented too deeply, however, neither by Americans nor by Europeans. The alternative to so-called American leadership, as we often describe it, is not chaos, and it need not be chaos. It can still be a rules-based order as much as the one that has figured so prominently for so long in our policy pronouncements, if not necessarily so often in our policy. To me, the challenge facing Europe now is clear: to work with others, not the United States, or at least not mainly the United States, to define the new order and Europe's place in it in a way that serves the interests of Europe's citizens. It is also the best way for Europeans at the present time to help Americans, is to pursue autonomy. You counted on us for decades. I would say now we are counting on you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you've given us a lot to think about. I'm going to start with a question that touches on things that both of you mentioned. I had some narrower questions focused on Europe and focused on Scandinavia, but let's start big, since you've both put big issues on the agenda. We're in a moment of flux. It's not clear if we're in a transition to what, and it's also hard if you're in the middle of history to know what kind of historical era you're in. This is the kind of thing you are only able to really intelligently talk about once it's all over and you can look about it in the past. But we don't have the luxury of being historians because we are living in the present. So it's obvious, right, that geopolitical balances have been shifting for a while, although the US still controls a preponderance of economic and military power globally. That hasn't changed that much. But one thing that is clearly changing is that since the end of the Cold War, there has been a pretty well-established idea of the US and Europe as the foundation of the liberal international order or the rules-based order, some idea that there are states who are going to push for a world governed by rules and institutions as opposed to old-fashioned geopolitics and self-interest. Until this year, I think it wouldn't be clear that that has changed that much, because the US under previous administrations, with some deviation under Trump 1, still was part of the foundation of that order. Now, that is not the case. It's only been a few months, and we don't know how this is going to end, but something fundamental has changed. So it will take a while for the world to grapple with this if this becomes the permanent state of things. What does it mean then if the US is no longer on the side of norms and institutions and rule of law, and Europe is alone? What does the world look like when the rest of the world is doing either one thing or all different things, but Europe is the last harbor of the idea that the world should be governed by something other than naked self-interest?
You're asking me?
I am asking you.
Okay. Yeah, sure. It doesn't look pretty, to be honest, and I was struck a little bit by the I would say pitch black tone of your analysis. There's a lot to agree, of course, with that, but the conclusions somehow seem to imply that that if we are dealing with such a rogue United States, and I'm not willing to buy that yet, but maybe that's wishful thinking. I don't know. That remains to be seen. It seemed to imply that the world could somehow keep operating as if the United States did not exist, but it does, and it will be a massive force, either for good or for ill, in the world going forward, with 25% of the world GDP, with the military forces that we talked about, and I think it will make its presence felt in so many different ways that there is just, I don't think, no way the Europeans could somehow carve out a rules-based niche for itself where it can continue to exist, let alone try to successfully order or maintain some kind of a rules-based order in the world out there. So if this is the reality we're dealing with, the prognosis is pretty grim. But I don't think the future is set in stone in any meaningful respects. And actually, I think the most horrible news I probably have, if we engage in a competition of really bad news for the audience who made the trek here today, is that anyone who is hankering after some kind of stability or order might have to wait quite some time. Because I think if my analysis is correct, that we have entered this world of triple transition, most of these transitions are only starting to pick up speed. Climate change is making its effects felt only now, and it's not going to go away. It will get much, much worse before it gets better, if ever. The same is with biodiversity loss. The same is with technological change. We are only now beginning to ride the curve of exponential change that will go on for as long as the eye can see. And therefore, for me as a social scientist, it seems like a safe bet to assume that also the third transition, the power transition between the states and within the states and societies, is only just beginning. And therefore, I've used the poetic expression that orders are moments crystallized moments of time when the certain power balance or equilibria has been established. And I don't see any equilibria for years or perhaps even decades. So I think we will be living in this world of flux one way or another. And I think the question is whether we try to manage most of these transitions in a sensible way together in order to find some kind of a norm of coexistence and hopefully prosperity, or whether we're just going to go on this horrible race to the bottom. And that's not a route I would recommend to anyone.
Yeah, thanks. I would sort of contend that a couple things are already evident and that they ought not to be ignored. First of all, that I think this depiction of the United States as bestriding the globe quite in the terms that you described, with 25% of GDP, nominal GDP that is, and the preponderant military force exaggerates the role of the United States in the world. I think when Americans hear this, they misunderstand the role of the United States in the world. All of this sort of potential power that we have that might be reflected in these terms has not translated into effective foreign and security policy in many, many cases for decades now. So the value of this ascription of the United States, or to the United States of this vast power, I think is somewhat misleading. The second thing I would say is it did not really reside so neatly in the Atlantic. I recently put something out that said Atlanticism is over. And I do think that Atlanticism as a philosophy of international affairs is over. The sort of automaticity of the notion that our first partners in initiating any kind of international initiative would always be our European allies has not been true for some time. And I think to cling to it is to ignore what is really going on in the world. Latin America, for example, is a place where many of these same values are upheld and realized. The Western Pacific, for heaven's sake, Canada, which is a very big country that's only like 90 miles from here, is not Europe. So to think that the Atlantic relationship is quite so central to these values on the planet, I think is mistaken. alternative is also not chaos. I think the notion that a multipolar system in which the United States is not a key constructive participant need not mean chaos for the world. We will be one of a number of actors. Perhaps our role will return to one that is more constructive in coming years. Perhaps it will not. But what I would say is a more important point from my point of view is, what do you do in the meantime? What do you do when all of the signals point down for the United States as far as its engagement with the world is concerned? And there you need to steel yourself for the worst case scenario where the United States does not return to this benign role in Europe. And that's why I think sounding this alarm a little more stridently rather than, okay, things are bad, but let's hope that things are going to be better. Hope is not a strategy, and I think right now there's a need for a lot of strategic thinking.
Okay, great. So let's talk about strategic thinking then. So in a multipolar world where the US together with Europe doesn't bestride the globe and either try to dictate or spread its values, what kinds of coalitions do we envision would come about? What other actors out there will Europe align with, and on what kinds of issues? Do we see certain coalitions coming together around trade, and other coalitions coming together around security, and other coalitions coming together around fighting climate change, coming up with regulations on artificial intelligence? And can the countries that have usually been seen as adversarial to liberal norms, like China, perhaps one day Russia, and countries that are sort of neutral, not necessarily autocratic and not necessarily in the world of democracies such as they are, places like Brazil and India, to what extent then are we likely to see different coalitions coming about for different purposes, and what role should Europe have in trying to form those coalitions? Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, sure. I think probably, and I do agree with John quite a bit here, I think we are probably moving towards some kind of a patchwork of different arrangements and different solutions depending on the context at hand. Mercosur that you mentioned is a good example where there is some positive movement. I had, it was probably a Chatham House event because I had a private lunch with the ambassador from Brazil in Helsinki, but I'm going to report it here today in any case. And it was interesting to hear when he said that in terms of trade, Europe is much more important than the United States for Brazil, or China for that matter, so that they tend to look for Europe for sort of cooperation and economic partnership. And they see a lot of, at least with the current president, they see, or think they see a lot of eye to eye in terms of many key issues, including the need for sort of some kind of a rules-based international order, whatever it could mean in the world going forward. So we will probably get some of that, and there Europe can play a role. We are also, in terms of security, we are seeing this emergence of this coalition of the willing. Now it's mainly in the context of the war in Ukraine, but the interesting part, of course, it is, in the words of President Stubb from Finland, is that it's at the same time it's both EU plus and EU minus, because it is not all the EU member states taking part in this coalition of the willing, but there are some non-EU countries, very important ones, that are taking part in the coalition. Norway, well, UK, Canada, Australia, which goes to show that there is some kind of an emergence. But this is a patchwork. If we are headed in the world that you described, I have a hard time seeing that they could really generate, I would say, completely adequate responses. They are not even the next best thing compared to the original alternative, but they are really a sign of the essential weakness and uselessness of the current setup, and therefore not very, very far from an ideal solution, I'm afraid.
Yeah, Hiski, I would agree that this is not an ideal solution. We're looking for available solutions. Who are Europe's partners? I think what we've seen over the last 2 decades is that countries in that play a role in the hedging middle are more successful in executing their foreign policy than those that are locked into alliance relationships like the one between Europe and the United States. Look at a country like India or Turkey, even a member of the NATO that operates sort of as a free hand. You can certainly raise serious objections to Erdogan's rule inside of Turkey, but in terms of its conduct of foreign affairs, it has raised the sort of balance of Turkey in a large region over, let's say, 20 or 30 years, with its ups and downs, but tending to have a capacity to advance what it perceives as being the interests of the Turkish people more effectively than it would have if it had remained a very compliant ally of the United States in NATO. But this is even more true of countries like India, Brazil, and especially China, which was never our ally. I think the magnitude of China something that people need to be reminded of all the time, because China surpassed the United States in purchasing power parity defined GDP in 2014, and it has never fallen behind us again since. It has maintained higher levels of economic growth consistently, except for at the height of the COVID pandemic, and it is not facing the same kinds of profound, I would say, challenges of governance and competence that the United States is facing right now. So it's likely that at the end of this current administration, China will be further ahead of the United States than it is already. So what does that mean for Europe? It means that Europe cannot ignore the value of cooperating more closely with China in areas where it shares common interest. And it certainly should not be driven into opposing China on the false premise that somehow by doing that and aligning more closely with the United States, it is advancing its common interest with the United States in some way that is more tangible. Countries around China and other countries in the world, including in Europe, have misgivings about China for a variety of reasons. China is very disruptive in many ways. The domestic regime is oppressive. But China is a huge success. It has more capacity in international relations than any other country, certainly with the likely exception for the time being of the United States. And an issue like climate change, technology, if you choose to exclude closer cooperation and even alignment with China on these issues in the hope of relying on the United States, I think you are actually blinding yourself to potential that might actually enable you to resolve some of your own issues and jointly resolve some of the globe's issues more effectively than if you just default to the Atlantic.
Okay, so to this point, we've been talking about the European Union as a given, as an actor that will reliably act in the world much as it's doing now. But of course, European countries are susceptible to the same forces that led to Trump in greater or lesser measure. Yeah. In a couple years, there's going to be a very important election in France. In Germany, the AfD is not necessarily rising, but still there, still a force to be reckoned with. Well, in the UK, the Reform Party, is that what it's called now? Yeah, is polling ahead of the Conservatives. So how resilient is the EU as an actor that would be able to hang together in the face of potential populist and nationalist uprisings? And then, how durable is the EU as a force for democracy when, even within it, there are not fully democratic governments?
Yeah, there are challenges that cannot be denied when it comes to Europe and the European Union, and they are, of course, well reported and very well known. At the same time, I would like to think that there is a window of opportunity for Europe to avoid some of the most negative outcomes when it comes to its future. And the interesting thing is about Mr. Trump is that he has a lot of effects in the world, and one of the effects seems to be, at least in certain instances, that he actually manages to lessen the appeal of populist movements in other countries. So we saw that probably in Canada in the recent elections. We saw it in Finland. We had municipal and local elections where the populist party lost massively, and at least part of the result has been explained as being just a reaction of Finns to what Trump has been doing and saying here in America. So that could be a factor to a certain extent. But most importantly, we have this now a promising situation in Europe where we have actually a new government in Germany, a new, I would say, energetic and hopefully successful chancellor in Germany who will be able to push Germany in a good direction, both in terms of economic policies and also in terms of assuming a larger role in European security and potentially also defense. We still have a situation in France with Macron in power, and we have the Starmer in the United Kingdom. So we probably have a breather of a couple of years to nudge things in a more favorable direction. And it's not inevitable that these political forces that you mentioned will march into power. Should that transpire, it will be very bad news for Europe, most obviously. And I heard it was said as a jest, but there was an element of truth into it. That the worst scenario, of course, for Europe would be that we get Chancellor Merz investing all of this money into German defense capabilities, turning Germany, as he has said, the biggest military in Europe. And then in 4 years' time, we have Alternative for Deutschland as the biggest party in Germany with this sort of machinery at their disposal, and that's not a happy scenario. Or we could have Marine Le Pen or someone of her ilk as the next president in France. But these are not inevitable outcomes, but it should we enter in that direction, it would be very bad news, obviously, for the institutionalized version of Europe that we know and at least I have come to love.
Great. I agree that there are many good things happening in Europe for the time being, and I would say the latest elections, for example, in Romania, where people were quite concerned,
Sure.
turned out very differently. Same with the first round of elections in Poland for the presidency. So there are many signs that this sort of somewhat dampened momentum on the extreme right is beginning to take hold more broadly, not just in the countries you mentioned, plus Australia, of course, and others. The project of Europe, I think, is reviving, and the reason is threats. The threat is something that I dealt with a lot in NATO. I was always, I'll just tell you, someone who advocated that the alliance should work much harder to inspire a sense of threat when we were very slow to react to the first Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. I was a very lonely voice urging people to actually work hard to create the sense of fear more broadly in Europe, and not only in the frontline states, the Nordics, the Baltics, and Eastern Europe. That was not a popular view then, but of course it's a very popular view now. But the second threat that I think is more transformative is, in all honesty, the threat from the United States. Because this is such a betrayal, as it's been portrayed by many European and other leaders of allied countries, that it has landed with a much stronger effect than the mounting threat that has existed from Putin in Moscow for some years. It's also worth bearing in mind that Trump's intention is to divide Europe in order to weaken Europe. He makes every effort to do that. It's I think, symbolic of the malevolence of the United States toward the European Union under Trump. So I think with the new project driven by a perception of threat, it's likely to return, or at least creates the possibility for returning Europe to a new phase of further integration. It's already been started. Things have happened under COVID. Things are happening with defense that would never have been possible. This change in the position of the Christian Democrats in Europe, in Germany, toward excess borrowing above the so-called Schuldenbremse, the brake on debt, was also reflected in their attitude toward European joint borrowing, which had always been rigidly opposed. And you know, Nordics are also among the countries that have often opposed shared borrowing. Same with Netherlands. The so-called responsible fiscal states have been very, very reluctant to endorse sort of pooling of fiscal resources in the European Union. But if you're going to succeed, I think you're going to have to loosen the purse strings and be willing to share risk in terms of this debt, something that a person who went through the Greek and Cyprus financial crises firmly believed for a long time.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to get to audience questions soon, but before I do, because we are at the Nordic Museum and I want everyone to get their money's worth, I'm going to ask you about that part of the world. So it's now been a little bit over 1 year since Sweden joined NATO and a little over 2 years since Finland joined. What's the mood there? Any regrets? And how has that gone?
I think the mood is still quite positive, I would say, to a certain extent. Not necessarily when it comes to the Trump or some of the ongoing trends and trajectories at the moment, but just the fact of the matter that the Finnish and Swedish NATO membership has brought the Nordics much closer together. I would argue that one of the very few silver linings of the last 3 years is this coming together of the Nordic countries, and not only the Nordics, but also the Baltics entering the fray. We talk about the NB8, the Nordic Baltic 8, much more than we used to previously. And I think this has changed, I would say, economic geography, political geography in Northern Europe and in the Nordics, and also military geography to a significant degree. One indication of this is the fact that before these changes, there used to be an entity called NORDEFCO, which was Nordic Defence Cooperation Initiative, and it was a complete non-starter, a dead letter, because none of the Nordic countries could agree what it entailed and what it actually meant, because none of them were looking at the world and the term security in a similar manner. So if you were sitting in Helsinki, you were looking at the Karelian Isthmus, St. Petersburg and the Gulf of Finland and the Åland Islands as well. And that for Finns was security. If you went to Sweden, they would say that no, it's Scotland and probably Åland Islands and the southern Baltic Sea. That for us is security. If you went to Norway, they say no, none of this is important or interesting. It's the high north, it's the Arctic, it's the Svalbard and all of these things. That's security. And if you went to Denmark, Copenhagen, they said, none of this makes any sense to us. We are so busy doing expeditionary operations with the Americans in faraway places and countries of that we never even have heard before. And now, because of this NATO integration, we have come to understand that actually all of these things hang together. And they are all part of the same area of operations, all part of the same sphere of military security. And interestingly enough, the Danes have come to appreciate that as well. They see and appreciate the importance of regional security dynamics. And this is, I think, a very profound shift when it comes to the Nordics and a very positive development. On top of that, we have now something that was historically tried many times before and was always impossible to achieve, which is that we have a written security commitment and guarantee between all the Nordic countries. Now we've done it. For example, Finland, we were on our knees begging for Sweden to do this in the 1930s. And they said, rather not. We have other concerns. They were much more concerned about Nazi Germany. We were really concerned about the Soviet Union, and it was just impossible to make these two stories to come together. Now we have done the commitment, and then, of course, the interesting question is: should NATO falter? Should it fall apart? Should Europe somehow not or fail to materialize as a security actor? Is this a foundation on which the Nordics could still hang together in the future? I'm semi-hopeful or optimistic in this respect. So I think the mood still, even as of today in the Nordics when it comes to security, is that actually our glass is half full, which is a refreshing change.
It also shows how a former imperial power, Sweden, can be tamed and come to respect its neighbors after only about 300 years.
But
a model for the world, I think.
They were one of the nice imperial powers always. So.
Okay, now we're going to open the floor for questions. Yes, over there. And there's a microphone coming around from the back, so just wait.
Well, first, Mr. Koenig, you have a Gig Harbor team here, 3 in a row that are Gig Harbor area, and you've left us, so, come back and visit. The view that all Americans get hung around the neck with what the Trump administration is doing is harmful in my idea of how we really are, because historically, I come from a military family. My father and his generation fought side by side with the Canadians and the Europeans and the Australians, and the affection and the worldview of many Americans is that these are still our allies despite the erratic behavior of the current chief executive. So I was hoping that you gentlemen could talk a little bit about regular Americans and their view and how that might play into the international scene.
I'll take a crack at that. I agree with you 100% that this current administration does not represent the majority, I would say even, of Americans with regard to these issues of international affairs. However, and I think that's important, and people should recognize it, and it could potentially make a huge difference in the long run. Clearly, we do have elections coming up, we hope, and hopefully the outcome will be different. However, where we've seen the Trump administration concentrate a lot of its effort is to actually sideline every incursion into the unitary authority of the executive, and in this case, the person of the executive, Donald Trump, over the entire executive apparatus, and in particularly the execution of foreign affairs, which is enshrined in the Constitution as an executive branch responsibility. So we are likely to face a foreign policy that is aligned personally with Trump, and we've seen that completely over the last 100 days. There has been no significant pushback from American other American actors against Trump's conduct of foreign affairs. When he went up with that idiotic chart on the 2nd of April, he was creating American tariff policy. This is in an area where he actually has very limited policy. He has invoked emergency provisions of law in order to execute law by executive decree, and this is not being challenged. When they talk about what's going to happen with tariffs, it is entirely framed in what will Trump agree to. This is a situation that I think means that the views of most Americans with regard to foreign affairs are rather unimportant for the moment for the conduct of American foreign policy. And, if you read editorials in most newspapers, ranging from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times, everybody's outraged, and it makes no difference. So let's just see how this works out over time. I'm not sure it makes a whole lot of difference for the foreseeable future.
Hiski, did you want to add anything?
Well, I think I've been talking too long in any case already, but I do see the dangers and the complications. I don't want to come across as hopelessly naive, and maybe this is a form of small state realism, is that you always try to put up a brave face, no matter what the adversity or the situation at hand might be. But I'm not willing to write off, and I'm not ready to write off America and Americans as a sort of as a friend and a partner, and even an ally going forward, and partly because we are just as a country and as a nation, as Finns, we are just entering the conversation and getting to know you so much better. And I think one of the lessons that I learned working for President Niinistö in particular is that it makes as much sense to talk about America in unitary terms than it makes sense to refer to Europe as some kind of a single entity. This is a universe we are talking about, the United States of America, and having had the conversations for the last 2 days here in Seattle has gone to show that there are many voices, many perspectives, and for example, I'm not talking about security guarantees from the Washington state here, but when I think that I hail from a country of 5.5 million population, now being here in Washington state with population of 8 million, this one state alone is enough of a partner in many meaningful terms and respects. And the conversations we had together with Senator earlier today about so many things that actually bring us together, so many common interests, so many common projects, so many things we can actually do together that I'm not willing to give up on this possibility. I'll keep pushing, and I think you should do the same as well.
Yes.
I'm curious about the border situation in Europe. I am Danish, and a few of my friends have said that, or feel in Denmark, that the situation about Greenland is just hopeless, because what is Europe going to do if the US decides that they will have Greenland one way or the other? I mean, is it one of these things where during the Falkland War you declare war and then you spend 3-4 weeks to get to Greenland? Or who is going to defend Greenland? Who is going to defend Latvia if Russia decides to invade? Who's going to defend Poland? I'm just curious what your opinions are and what scenarios you see if the security situation worsens.
I think the defense of Greenland, if it should reach that stage, and I really, really hope that it does not, the defense of Greenland against American action would be impossible. So I think that would, there would certainly be political resistance, there might be even some military resistance, but the capacity of a country with 340 million people and a vast military would be able to conquer Greenland if that is what it came to. I don't think it'll come to that. But I think that's a very different question from what will happen in the case of an invasion of Latvia or the invasion of any country that's along that eastern boundary of Europe, facing Russia. There, I think you can have a lot more confidence that solidarity will genuinely prevail. And it's not only out of a sense of moral solidarity, it's out of a sense of a common fate, And once things reach that stage, I would be quite confident. I would even, kind of to lean a little bit into the direction Hiski is going, I would say there's a fair chance that the United States would do the right thing. That's just not where we used to be. We used to be, let's say our confidence level was never 100%. Our confidence level was in a high range. It was adequate to feel confident, and that also helped with deterrence. we are at the same time undermining confidence among our allies and undermining deterrence with our opponents. This is a really dangerous situation, but that doesn't mean we wouldn't do the right thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So I was just interested in, I had read recently that Putin was saber rattling along the Finnish border there. Obviously, I know you've got a long history together, Russia and Finland, in terms of wars. Is this just nonsense, or is it something that you should be concerned about?
And a pretty long border here.
Yeah, it is significant. It's 1,340 kilometers, and it is a significant stretch of land, that's for sure. The good news is that no sabers are being actively rattled next to Finland for the moment. There are no major troop movements or amassment on the Finnish border because they are still currently being decimated in Ukraine, and so is the case with the military hardware that the Russians has. So there is no acute threat. What the Russians are doing and what the reports are implying and telling is that Russia is in the process of building the logistical base and foundations for eventual troop amassment at some future point in time. And they have always indicated this. I mean, I never thought I would be in a position to try to explain the Russian perspective to an audience ever again, but here I go. If I was advising the president of Russia in the Kremlin, of course I would write a memo that our strategic outlook has deteriorated massively because if you look at things from the Russian perspective, the Finnish and Swedish memberships are a massive strategic loss and a huge potential military headache for Russia. And they always said so, and they also indicated that they would have to respond in kind. And that's what they will eventually do. So there will be an enhanced Russian troop presence also on the Finnish border, but it's primarily and most probably and in the final instance hopefully not meant to invade Finland or Norway for that matter, but it's there to ensure and signal the Russian understanding of military balance and correlation of forces between the enhanced NATO presence in Northern Europe and what they think for their own defense. The problem with soldiers is that they are dual-use goods, so they can be used for defense or for offense, and that can never, unfortunately, be excluded when it comes to Putin's Russia. And that's why it is very important that the NATO deterrence, or perhaps in some point in time in the future, some kind of a European deterrence or defense, is credible and robust enough to discourage any further adventures on the part of Russia.
Yeah, up here. Microphone's coming your way.
This is actually a question for Dr. Haukkala. But Professor Radnitz, you made the observation that is possibly some backlash to the effects of Trumpism internationally, that moderate political parties, at least momentarily, have been successful in recent elections. But again, for Dr. Haukkala, to what degree do you think growing inequality in Western Europe threatens long-term prospects for a coherent European foreign policy?
Sure, and it does, although foreign policy has never been a particularly democratic sport, even in democracies. So it's been an elite sport to a certain extent, and that to a certain extent applies also on the European level. But I think the problem and the danger is more profound than that, because I think what we are seeing and have been seeing also in Europe is I would say, failure of normal politics and normal policies. And for a very long time we have been living in a situation where a good deal of population in many European countries simply do not feel that they are represented by the current parties, by the current politicians, and they don't recognize their identity, their interests, and their needs in the outcomes of the political process. And I think this is a horrible problem for democracies and even the future of Europe going forward if it is not rectified one way or another. Because obviously it's too easy an explanation that all these populist movements draw their strength from just people being ignorant and stupid or evil. And that is not the case. They are ordinary citizens, normal people with real issues and grievances, and they don't feel represented and they become angry. And then these snake oil salesmen enter the fray and say, I have the solutions, and they can use this political energy into very, very nefarious ends. So I think what we need to do, and I really am on my knees hoping and praying that we use this opportunity now in Europe to show the people, the ordinary folks, that the sort of the established parties can deliver the goods, they can generate economic growth, they can give people opportunities, they can take good care of our security, and also develop the European project. Because if we fail to do that and make a mess of this opportunity, then we might be in for a really rough time also on the old continent, I'm afraid.
Ambassador Koenig, you said that the old order, if I paraphrase, the old order has been failing and Trump simply accelerated that. And I'd like you to expand a little bit more, please, on the first portion of that.
Sure. My career as an active diplomat spanned the period from 1984 to 2015. So I would say the watershed really was around the end of the so-called unipolar moment of the United States. That really initiated, I think, a divergence between the United States and our partners that began, you might say, with September 11th, 2001. This was experienced deeply personally by many Americans, but it had effects that created a new gulf between us and our European partners on a number of fronts. Even though we managed to cooperate a lot in terms of counterterrorism activity, in terms of operations in Iraq as a coalition of the willing, and in Afghanistan as a NATO operation, and at least in part, we diverged very heavily, I think, on the rule of law beginning at that time. The role of international law in international relations was one side, and then the actual execution of the rule of law in the relationship between governments and citizens on the other. On the international law side, we saw at that time real pushback from the Europeans with regard to an operation in Iraq that was clearly illegal internationally. There was no international legal basis for the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And that produced what I would regard as the last serious effort by Europe to define the values in terms of military operations of the Atlantic Alliance. You saw Schröder and Chirac campaign internationally to try to block the United States from executing that invasion, and it failed, and the response from Europe was to be more compliant with the United States, to subordinate their views on these issues more deeply to the United States. And after that, the role of international law in operations became more of a minor theme. But on the interrelationship between citizens and governments, the security state that was established in the United States beginning during the post-9/11 era has gone much further than we would see very often allowed in Europe. Europe started from a higher level of intrusion into citizens' lives, but it seemed to recognize in many ways the value of privacy, the value of sort of regulation of private interests that might exploit the vulnerabilities of individuals in terms of information and so forth. So Europe started at a more intrusive place, but the United States vastly leapfrogged Europe, and now the United States has essentially a laissez-faire approach to the handling of private information. Our security services are vastly more intrusive than they are in Europe with regard to vacuuming vast amounts of data. This is a cultural divide that I think really began to characterize the transatlantic relationship during that period, and that was the most important, in my view, factor to disrupt the old order. Maybe that and the rise of East Asia in general, not just China, but the monumental transfer of global wealth and economic activity from the Atlantic to the Western Pacific over the last 40 years.
Yes.
So Dr. Haukkala talked about how climate change will be maybe the least talked about, but the largest transitional factor happening. How will climate change affect European trade? And like, what would the European Union or Europe in general, what would their solution be for effectively fighting it? Because, like in Norway, they make enough hydroelectric power almost to power all of Norway, but their largest export is also oil and natural gas. So with climate change becoming an increasingly, well-known thing that's affecting everyone, how will that maybe start impacting things like that?
This is a very good question and a difficult one to answer, to be honest. And we are still, and I'm going to be very careful how I phrase this, because I'm both seriously jet lagged as I speak, and I also have a lot of good Norwegian friends. So this is a dangerous combination that we are dealing with here. But I think the fact of the matter is that they are effectively carbon neutral in terms of their own sort of electricity generation and so on and so forth, and they obviously make a strong contribution also when it comes to the Nordic electricity market. So they definitely play a positive role here. There's also, I think, we are still living in a world of where fossil fuels have not been made illegal. Maybe they should. The sooner the better, most probably. But it is still a legitimate piece of business, and they keep doing it. I'm also under the impression that they have a pretty high standards when it comes to how they invest the windfall, because most of the money that they actually make are turned into the sovereign wealth fund, and they try to use that to do good things. So I think they are a decent citizen when it comes to this particular question. That said, I think we are in a genuine bind. We are not doing enough to counter the climate change. We are not succeeding in this task. Also, although interestingly enough, I think it was only last week when there were reports that the emissions of China are now declining, which is an important development in its own right. I think what Europe can do is first of all to make our own economies and societies as carbon neutral as possible, as quickly as possible. Finland is a world leader in terms of targets, 2035. I'm not sure if we will achieve it, but we will be pretty close around that time. The problem is that not everyone is following suit. And right now, under Trump, obviously, America is showing very negative leadership in a sense that even though I know a lot of, on the state level in America, still a lot of positive developments are taking place, but I think he's giving sort of diplomatic cover to a lot of countries who don't want to do much about the situation. And this is, of course, problematic and harmful. The challenge for Europe is that even if we reduce our emissions to zero, it's not enough. And even if we used all our sort of development aid to support carbon transitions in the developing economies, it will not be enough either. And we desperately need the other big boys and girls here working together. And that, of course, means China, where I think there is a lot positives that they can bring to the table. Hopefully one day the United States as well, also on the federal level, and countries like India and others who will be the key in order to ensure that we can have a half a chance of navigating this challenge.
So we are reaching the end of our evening, and one of our panelists is a bit jet-lagged for understandable reasons. Maybe just to wrap up, if you'd like to share a few words of wisdom to leave with the audience, this gives a chance for future historians to look back and then see whether what you were saying tonight was either prescient or foolish. And now's your chance to be on the record for that. Would you like to go first, John?
Sure. I share pretty unvarnished and probably deliberately provocative views about what's happening, but I think the reason I do that is for a couple of reasons. One is to provoke, because I think Americans, and I am one of you, do not appreciate the possibility that we could be left behind, that we are not central in the same way that we often conceive to the actual conduct of world affairs. And we have enabled ourselves to play a critical role by being constructive, generally speaking, over the last 70 years. That has eroded over 20 years, and as Ernest Hemingway famously wrote in The Sun Also Rises, how did you go bankrupt? Well, at first, gradually, and then suddenly. I'm afraid we're in the sudden phase. And I think people's thoughts need to be focused on that. How do you deal with the sudden phase of American collapse? That would be, I agree with everyone else, an extreme emergency for the global community. But the way to deal with the prospective emergency is not to look away from it, it is to plan for it and to prepare for it. And that's really the only thing I worry about with regard to Europe. Prepare for the quite possible collapse of American leadership in the world.
Hiski, you get the last word.
Yeah, I can't help myself. I always have to end on a high and an optimistic note. So here's the effort, at least. I think the problem, the key challenge, I think, facing us as nations, as societies, individuals, and as some kind of a collective called humanity, is that we are trying to tackle with 21st century problems using awfully old-fashioned and old software and architecture. And I have used the expression that basically our basic software, when it comes to the operating system, is basically hails from the 19th century, and that is the nation states, which is the basis of how we have organized ourselves as human collectives. And there's a lot of positive things to be said about nation states. For example, in the case of Finland, it has been a salvation for us as a nation. I mean, being immersed into a multinational empire wasn't an entirely pleasant experience. It has been much nicer and better, I think, for Finland and hopefully for the world as well, that we have been able to organize into a collective called a nation state. So it's not entirely a bad thing, but it's a really old way of thinking about how to relate to the world and to each other. On top of this, our international architecture, to a certain extent, with which we are trying to deal with all of these 21st century problems, is even older still. It's basically from the 17th century, the notion of sovereignty from basically 1648 from the Peace Treaty of Westphalia, which was the first time that the term was used. And the actual operating system with which we try to coordinate international activities is something you know very well in this country. It's the so-called T-model Ford from 1920s. It's the international governance system based on conference diplomacies, cumbersome international governance structures such as the United Nations and so on and so forth. So when I, in my previous capacity as a university professor, was trying to help the students to understand why it is so difficult to solve these collective action problems in the world today, you need not look only, you can also do that, but not only to human greediness, stupidity, and sort of maliciousness. But the fact is, that explains most of our problems here today, is that we are operating on a really old-fashioned set of ideas that are increasingly becoming part of the problem instead of becoming the source of solutions. The good news is, and this is where I end, is that the world offers us plenty of pedagogical opportunities every day to do learning on individual and collective level. And I'm sure the time of turbulence we are entering, and I probably am in a lot of agreement with John here concerning many of the things he has been saying today, will offer us with plenty of learning opportunities. And if we do not use them to our collective and individual good, then we only have ourselves to blame if we end in a really bad place at the end of this journey. But I'm still optimistic and hopeful. That's why I'm interested in these things, and I try to do my very best to nudge us in a more positive and hopeful direction.
Spoken like a representative of a small country. So thank you. Before we close, I would like to thank the Nordic Museum, the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies and Scandinavian Studies Department, Senator Marko Liias. And now please join me in thanking our panelists, Hiski and John.